In this tutorial, we're going to go over how to do some lighting, specifically with directional lights and skydomes with HDR images, and what some of their attributes are. If you hit 7 in your scene without any lights, it'll just be completely black. And we need to add a light in order to see any of our information now. There are two tabs you can create lights. You have Arnold Lights, and then you have a list of lights that are only for Arnold. And if you come over to Create, there's a Lights tab, and most of these will work with Arnold and other render engines as well. A directional light can act as a sun source, and when we create it, you can see there is some lighting information now. And we have a new object in the scene, and it is a group of arrows. The actual location does not matter, neither does the scale. The only thing that matters for directional lights is the orientation. Where is it pointing? And you can see that there are arrows, and that is the direction that the light is coming from. So we have a little bit of lighting information, and you get some feedback from the light. If you take a render, it'll be much more accurate. And you can have multiple directional lights in the scene to get some good bounce lighting, and we'll go over some settings for that momentarily. When you select your directional light, or any light in Maya, you have your attribute editor, and you have a lot of different attributes that you can manipulate. At the very top, when we are in the lighting, it'll be the second tab, we have some basic parameters for color and intensity. If we change the color, we'll have a red or a purple or a blue tint to our light. By default, it will be white. Intensity will brighten the light a little bit. So let's open up the render view. And I have it at a very low resolution just so it renders a little bit faster. And if you bring the intensity slider over, it will be a much brighter light. There are a lot of other tabs here, and we don't actually want to go into the Shadows tab if we want to manipulate shadows. We want to go into the Arnold tab, because this light can work with a lot of different render engines. So when you open up Arnold, we now have a list of all of the Arnold specific attributes. At the very top is use color temperature, and color temperature is measured in degree Kelvin, and it's a good way to get some very accurate colors very easily. If you Google color temperature chart, you'll see that values around 1800 are closer to candle and firelight, and we get up to 10,000, it'll be clear blue skies with a range in between. When you turn on use color temperature, it will override whatever color you have set in the color tab. And if you bring it to the left, it'll be more reds and oranges. Bring it to the right, and you will get more blue skies with bluish tints. Exposure, I usually bring it to about 1, and then balance the exposure and intensity together to get a good lighting. Angle affects the shadows, and we don't actually see any shadows because there's nothing for a shadow to cast on. So I'm going to create a plane so we can now see this shadow. And if you notice how hard the shadow is, it's a very crisp edge. If you bring your angle up, it'll be a much softer shadow. You don't have to go all the way to one side or the other. You can find a nice spot somewhere in the middle and make your shadows look a little bit better. Samples will increase the overall quality of pieces of the render. And down here under visibility, we have diffuse, specular, subsurface scattering, and a lot of others. This will increase other channels of your light. So if you need your highlights to be a little bit more refined or turned down, you can turn down the highlights. So we zoom in here. The microscope tray, if you turn down your specular becomes much duller. So you're just manipulating different channels of that light. You can have more than one directional light, so it could be a good main light source, duplicate it, and then rotate it a little bit and have some bounce light. Usually your second light or your bounce light won't be quite as intense. I'm going to bring that intensity down. And there's now two shadows in the scene, which I don't want my bounce light to be casting this intense of a shadow. So I'm just going to go under the Arnold tab where it says Cast Shadows and turn that off. So as you can see, you can get fairly specific with your lighting just with these few options. The next light I want to go over is called a Skydome. And Skydomes are very powerful and they mimic the sky. They give you a really good ambient fill light. I'm going to group my two directional lights and just hide them for now. When a light is hidden, they will no longer cast light. So they are essentially no longer in the scene. To create a Skydome, I'm going to come to Arnold, Lights, and Skydome Light. And I now have a very bright scene. You can see there's light coming from everywhere. And if I hit play in my render, I have a nicely lit scene. However, there's no shadows. There's no direction to this light. You'll have a little bit of shadows in the occluded areas, but there's no actual direction. It is a fairly flat light. You can combine it with your directional lights and get a better lit scene with some shadows and can make it look very nice pretty easily. One thing about Skydome lights, if you check their attributes in the attribute editor, you have some very similar looking parameters. You have color, intensity, exposure, color temperature. However, you won't get great reflections in your scene because it is just a gray void. You can very easily change the color temperature, so it's a blue void now, but it's still not very exciting. And this is where HDR images come in very useful. You can download them from Polyhaven. They have about 500 HDR images you can use for free, and you can load them onto your Skydome just like you would any other texture. So I'm going to go up to Color, click on the checker box, and choose File. And then I'm going to search for my HDR images. The HDR images will either be a .HDR or .EXR. The TX files are what Arnold will convert all textures to. So now that I loaded in a Misty Pines HDR image, we can now see it in the viewport. And when I hit play, it will now give some more interesting reflections and will actually light the scene properly. Another way to see the effect that your lights are having in the scene, especially HDR images, is going to hide my microscope. And I'm just going to create a sphere and apply a new AI standard surface. And I'm going to bring the metalness slider up. So you can see it now has a more metallic look to it. One thing, the reason that it is still blue, you have to turn off use color temperature because that overrides your color. There we go. So now it has a more metallic look and is reflecting the scene. And if you bring your roughness to the right, it won't reflect at all. It'll be a very rough surface. To the left, it'll be very reflective, and you can see the effect it has, the AI Skydome has on your objects. So that's the basics of rendering. You can't just have a skydome, you need to have a direction for your light as well. So a skydome and a directional light can act as sunlight and sky working together. And you can have multiple directional lights in your scene as well to help get some bounce light and some extra shadows or highlights if you need it.